For our next session, it's going to be a slightly different quite a different format from the last couple. I'm not going to do the introducing, but I will introduce the moderator. We're delighted to have moderating the next session on federal and California immigration policies, Kate Morrissey, a reporter with the San Diego Union-Tribune, and she is going to introduce each of our three panelists. So here, please join me in welcoming Kate.
I believe so. Oh, hey. So good afternoon, everybody. I hope you have recovered from the blood sugar hit from lunch. I think this will be a pretty lively conversation, so hopefully it wakes you up if you haven't yet recovered from eating. Like you said, I'm Kate Morrissey. I'm the immigration reporter from the San Diego Union-Tribune. I cover both San Diego and Imperial counties, and I've been covering immigration for the paper since August of 2016. I'm the only immigration reporter at our paper, which is geographically situated in the heart of many of our current immigration debates. And so just to give you a little bit of a sense of that, we're on the border with Mexico. We have the 8 border wall prototypes in our backyard. We have a large refugee community with sizable groups from the countries affected by the travel bans. We have a booming biotech industry and many universities that benefit from H-1B and other employment visas. We have even the migrant caravan that has been so much the subject of the president's Twitter feed as of late arrived at our door in San Diego this week. So as you can imagine, my job over the last year and a half has been a little bit extra busy. I knew when I agreed to be here that something would happen this week that I would miss because I was here. So reporters have actually been helping me cover the migrant caravan so that I could prepare to be here with you. And another one is actually in federal court today because the ACLU is suing the Trump administration over separating families who are applying for asylum at the border in San Diego court today. So just a quick shout out to them for helping me so that I can be here sharing with you. And so I want to just set the stage a little bit but as I introduce our panelists, talking about federal and California immigration policies. California has actually been pushing back on federal immigration enforcement for decades before the Trump administration. San Francisco actually passed its first sanctuary-related policy in 1989. But things have certainly escalated since President Trump ramped up enforcement priorities shortly after taking office. So former President Obama was known in many ways as the deporter-in-chief for policies that he had in the first part of his administration. But in 2014, he changed enforcement priorities to specifically target people who had been convicted of certain crimes. And I want to emphasize that word convicted because that's part of what has changed. So President Trump undid that and added sort of a broader list of who he wanted immigration officials to target, which includes people who have been charged with crimes or are suspected with crimes. And the list of crimes is much broader. Under President Obama, it was a narrower set of like felonies, high-level misdemeanors, or series of misdemeanors that were generally the ones that people were being targeted for enforcement. And President Trump also included people who have prior deportation orders from immigration judges. So much of what you're seeing today about discussion of enforcement has to do with that change, and much of what we're seeing in California in response also has to do with that change. So in California, several laws have been passed over the last year, including probably the most famous one, SB 54. You may or may not have heard of it as the California Values Act. And what it does is it restricts local police's involvement with federal immigration enforcement. The Trump administration, of course, has sued over this in federal court, and some counties and cities in California have actually taken the administration's side in the lawsuit. So now you have even San Diego County, where Dulce and I call home, is part of the lawsuit on the administration side against the state. So it's getting to be quite complicated. This is actually not the first time the federal government has sued a state over immigration policy. If you'll remember, under the Obama administration, the Justice Department actually sued Arizona for what it considered to be too aggressive enforcement by its local police. So again, this is not something entirely new. It's just sort of a different rendition of it. Beyond SB 54, California has tried to offset the Trump administration's enforcement policies in other ways. The state has set aside money to help people facing immigration court pay for attorneys. There's a law moving through the state legislature now that would expand opportunities for unaccompanied children arriving at the border to receive help from different nonprofits. We'll begin our panel by focusing really on this idea of sanctuary policy, what it is, how it works, different perspectives on whether or not it's a good thing. But as we move into the Q&A, I would really encourage you all to think broadly about the kinds of questions that you can ask, because there's a lot of layers and a lot of different ways that the state and federal governments are interacting at this point. And then one last note before I introduce the panelists, I want to take a moment to remind all of you that everyone in here, whether you're seated in the audience or up here on this stage, is a human being, and as such deserves respect, no matter what opinion they might have. Immigration is a very emotion-driven topic, right? It hits us in our core because it sort of resonates with some part of our identity, no matter what side of the debate we're on. And so I would ask that you sort of recognize when those emotions are arising and try to remember that in order to have a practical and meaningful conversation, we have to be respectful despite whatever emotions we might be feeling, and just to be respectful to everyone in the room. Cool? All right, so now I'm going to introduce the panelists. First up is Karthick Ramakrishnan. He's the Associate Dean at UC Riverside School of Public Policy and Professor of Public Policy and Political Science. He is the founder and director of the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside. He is also a board member of the California Endowment, chair of the California Commission on APIA Affairs, and adjunct fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. His research focuses on civic participation, immigration policy, and the politics of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States. Among his many accomplishments, he has published 6 books, including Framing Immigrants and the New Immigration Federalism. I first saw him speak when he came to an event in San Diego where community leaders were brainstorming how to be more welcoming and supportive to newly arrived immigrants. He spoke about the importance of being critical of the words that we use, and I think you'll find the insight he provides into the layers of word choice can have in a debate pretty interesting. Sheriff Margaret Mims was elected sheriff in Fresno in November 2006. She has been a peace officer since 1980. She is a member of the Law Enforcement Immigration Reform Task Force coordinated through the National Immigration Forum in Washington, D.C. She's also the first female sheriff in the history of the Fresno County Sheriff's Office, which was established in 1856. She's also a member of the Fresno Cultural Arts Rotary Club, the Carruthers Kiwanis Club, and is on the board of directors of the Marjorie Mason Center, a local women's shelter. Sheriffs across California have found themselves in the middle of the debate over sanctuary laws and SB 54. They are often the ones who run the jails where ICE wants to be able to pick up unauthorized immigrants or green card holders convicted of crimes. Sheriffs are also the ones who need communities to trust them so that they can arrest people who commit crimes. And part of the debate is that some people say that trust disappears if law enforcement works with immigration officers. So I look forward to hearing how Sheriff Mims is navigating this debate. Dulce Garcia is an immigration attorney and a DACA recipient. You may have heard the phrase dreamer before to describe this group. Because of her immigration status, she found it impossible to find financial aid after high school, so she worked several jobs and paid her way through higher education, eventually obtaining her law degree. She has since opened her own law firm, which expanded to 2 offices last year, providing support to people in immigration court across San Diego. Garcia serves in the 2018 Border Angels Board of Directors. She is one of the named plaintiffs in the lawsuit against President Donald Trump and the administration over the termination of DACA. Last year, Garcia and other DACA recipients formed San Diego Border Dreamers to advocate for humane immigration laws and policies. Because she's from San Diego, Dulce is the person on this panel I know the best. I've watched her go from being an immigration attorney who happens to have DACA to being an activist and advocate in her community. She's well-versed in the law and also in the emotions and impact that different policies have on immigrant communities. So please join me in welcoming your panel. And I believe now we'll hear from each of the panelists before we go to questions.
Let's see if this works. Okay. I'm going to try to go through a whole bunch of research very quickly. So I'm going to draw on 3 projects that I've been involved with. I was on the National Academy of Science panel on the integration of immigrants into American society, co-author of a book, The New Immigration Federalism, co-author of a book, Framing Immigrants, and working on a new book project called Progressive State Citizenship. I also run a website called API Data, where we seek to make demographic and policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders more accessible to a range of audiences. Happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. We just rolled out a new data tool. Check it out. Let us know how we can improve what we do. So Many of the facts that I'll have in the beginning come from the National Academy's report, but what you'll see in those boxes below are updated data because the data have not been, I don't want to misrepresent what was in the report. So one, if you look at the number of immigrants or the foreign-born population of the United States, it is at record levels, but it's not at a record level if you look at the share of the overall population. So we're starting to approach what the share of immigrants were at the early part of the 20th century, but we're still shy of that level of about 15%. Right now, if you look at first and second generation immigrants, so these are the foreign-born and the children of the foreign-born, they're about a quarter of the US population. The foreign-born today number about 44 million, nearly 14% of the US population. Importantly, there's been some major shifts happening in the flow of immigration to the US. So over the last decade, you've had more Asian immigrants than Latin American immigrants, and that continues since we issued the report. You've also had a significant growth in the undocumented population from Asia. So if you look from 2000 to 2015, you've had more than a tripling of the Asian undocumented population. We've also seen increases in the undocumented population from Africa, the Caribbean as well. Granted, they started off at lower baselines, but if you think about the undocumented population today, Asians constitute a significant share of the total undocumented population. Or if you think about the Asian foreign-born, so 1 out of every 7 Asian immigrants in the country today is undocumented. So that's important to think about the Asian population when we think about the undocumented population. It's also important to think about the undocumented experience when we think about Asian immigrants. You also see the shift in terms of Asian versus Latin American immigration. If you look at legal permanent residence, the granting of LPR status by year, for the past decade, there have been more Asians than Latin Americans being granted legal permanent residence status. Finally, there's a lot of talk now about trying to reform our immigration laws to make it more skills-based rather than family-based. Many people might assume that Asian immigrants are primarily coming here on skills-based visas, but the reality is far from that. So the majority of Asian immigrants coming in on legal permanent resident status are still family-based visas, either immediate relatives or other family members. We find it important to put out data like this because there's so much mythologizing and stereotyping even within the Asian community in terms of who we are, who our immigrant populations are. Another important fact about immigration is that there's been a plateau and in fact a decrease in the unauthorized population over the last several years. And that's important to keep in mind when we have these immigration debates. Other important factors to consider: in the last decade, we've had not only net zero migration from Mexico, but actually negative migration from Mexico. So any talk about building a border wall related to immigration kind of strains credibility in terms of being a pressing policy problem. It might be there to solve other problems or serve a symbolic purpose, but it's certainly not necessary. In fact, it might be keeping immigrants in more than trying to keep them out. There's actually research on this where increased border enforcement in the late 90s and the decade following actually prevented more circular migration and kept the undocumented population in the US more than it should have. And then finally, there's been a lot of talk about crime and trying to link immigrants and especially undocumented immigrants with crime. But research after research, either measured in terms of the immigrant population or measures of changes in the undocumented population, show no relationship with crime. It's reminiscent a bit of the debate in Arizona where then Governor Jan Brewer talked about headless bodies in the desert, but could not produce any such examples of headless bodies in the desert. Crime, including crime at the border, has actually decreased in the last decade rather than increased. And yet, here we are talking about trying to solve a problem that is supposedly a national crisis. And that comes to our research on framing immigrants. What we found, so this came out right before the election, but it's part of a body of research which suggests that it's not the reality on the ground that matters, contrary to all good research and public policy where it has to be problem-oriented research and trying to solve actual problems that exist. What matters is the perception of the problem. And so what we do in that book is to look at how immigrants and immigration policy has been framed over time and whether those frames are consequential to opinion. I'll say as a caveat, this is a kind of initial foray into this research, and there's a lot more to be done. So do words matter? One perspective, going back to William Shakespeare, would suggest that words don't matter. What matters is the inherent qualities of the object. So you might not call something a rose, but it would still be a rose. It would still have that smell and color. But you have others who say that words do matter. And here's a powerful statement from Yehuda Berg, who says, words have energy and power with the ability to help, to heal, to hinder, to hurt, to harm, to humiliate, and to humble. So these are widely different perspectives on the power of words. Our research shows that words and frames can matter. They don't always matter. Where they matter is on when there are policy frames that are relatively new. So frames like amnesty and pathway do make a difference in terms of public opinion. Public opinion goes down when you talk about something as an amnesty. It's no coincidence that opponents to immigration reform keep using the word amnesty because they know that it works. Crime also matters, crime frames. On the progressive side, talking about children, talking about long-term residents, also moves opinion on immigration with the public more sympathetic. Interestingly, using words like illegal versus undocumented, we found made no difference in terms of public opinion on immigration policy, even though a lot of people spent a lot of time and attention on it. If you look today, there's a lot of talk about trying to use the word chain migration versus family migration, and you have someone with an extremely large bully pulpit who has mainstreamed this notion of chain migration that used to be a pretty fringe term in the conservative movement. You also have the president, including in the State of the Union and elsewhere, talking about immigrants versus Americans, whereas proponents talk about immigrants as Americans. And that's something that I think we could have a healthy conversation about, and which of these is true. Finally, when it comes to federalism, it's important to take the stretch of history. So I'm going to summarize a book in a minute here. So immigration federalism, you have this lost century of immigration federalism in the first century where you didn't really have national immigration policy. It was all done by states. Then the US passed the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and we enter into this period of federal supremacy. What we argue is that after 1965, we've entered into this new era of immigration federalism with the 1965 reforms increasing the unauthorized population in the United States by design. And then after 9/11, you have this period of polarized change. I'll just say quickly in terms of what this polarized change model is. What we show is that it's not a situation where you have federal inaction and then demographic change at the local level, pushing towards change at the state level. This is the conventional model of how policy change happens. What we argue instead is that it takes issue entrepreneurs, what they do is take advantage of party polarization and we called it ethnic nationalism. I think there'd be a different term for it now, post-2016. They take advantage of that and they actually engineer federal inaction and then turn around and say that the federal system is broken and we have to do something at the state level. That's at least what happened on the restrictive side. Today, we're seeing a different framework where the president himself is getting involved in proliferating state action. And that creates a new dynamic that I think if we wrote that book today or wrote an appendix to the book, it would be different. Finally, I'm running out of time, so I'll just talk about state citizenship. It's something that we argue exists, and it's not just progressive state citizenship. We also have variants like regressive and restrictive. And what we mean by this, when we talk about state citizenship, we look at it in a federated framework, and we look at the extent to which states can either increase, decrease, or reinforce the same kind of rights that are available to citizens versus non-citizens, undocumented immigrants versus authorized immigrants at the federal level. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. It's truly an honor to be here on the campus of Stanford. Just from a little girl that grew up in a very small town in Central California, this is just awesome for me to be here and talk to you all. And teachers in the room, you know, I thought I wanted to be a teacher until I worked as a teacher's aide in a second grade classroom. And I figured out that was not going to be my career path. So here I am as the sitting sheriff of Fresno County, trying to explain some of the very complicated nuances of a very complicated subject. And where sheriffs find themselves in the middle of this particular issue is a learning experience, and I hope I give you some information that you didn't know before. In California, sheriffs in all 58 counties are responsible, except for 2 counties, are responsible for 2 things. Not only do we have frontline law enforcement response, so we answer calls for service, but we also have the responsibility to run our local jails. So when the discussion started on the sanctuary state bill that passed, SB 54, we were trying to figure out how do we work with the author, how do we work with the governor to make this a bill that we would not oppose. Of course, that's the best case scenario, don't oppose the bill, but we continued to oppose it for several reasons. For many years, sheriffs worked with ICE, with immigration, to make sure that we keep our community safe. Remember, that's what we're all about. How do we keep you safe? And what we understand is that our community relationship with our immigrant community is extremely important. One of the things that we can help with is our immigrant community, if they're victimized, to help them get what we call U visas, which means you cooperate with the reporting and the prosecution when you've been victimized. We can actually help you and recommend a U visa, which allows you to be here legally for 3 years. And it's a very important story that I think needs to get out there more. How many of you has heard about how law enforcement can help victims of crime that are here illegally be here legal? Probably not many, a few, okay. And that word needs to get out more. I truly think sometimes the news is used to scare our immigrant community into not reporting crimes, because no sheriff's office in the state of California asks our immigrant victims, where were you born, or are you here legally? That was never an issue. That was, and that's part of SB 54. So that part of the law was not a problem for us. We do not ask in frontline law enforcement what the immigration status is of victims of crimes. In fact, we can help you be here legally. And that's a real important nuance, I think, that helps our immigrant community and helps us actually build trust. Now, immigration in our jails is a separate issue. And that issue is, at what point is it appropriate for ICE to come into our jails and talk to somebody or interview somebody regarding their legal status? For many years, we actually held, all sheriffs in California held immigrants for the 48-hour hold. And there were 2 lawsuits across the United States that says you can't do that because it violates civil rights, which I agree with. By statute, we can only hold somebody by some kind of legal authority. And if there's no due process, that legal authority goes away. And I agree with those court decisions. So we stopped doing the 48-hour holds, but we allowed ICE to come into our jail facilities to do their work. Now, one thing that SB 54 did was still allows ICE to come into the jails. I can't give them permanent office space, but I can allow them to come in. They cannot use our database. They only have to look at public source information. I cannot tell them about people that get booked into our jails that are booked for certain crimes. And to me, the dangerous overall precedent is we have a state government now trying to tell local law enforcement which other law enforcement agency they can and can't talk to. Every other law enforcement agency that we work with has access to our database except ICE. Every other law enforcement agency I can talk about any inmate in my jail. We've got about 3,000 people, by the way, in our local jail in just Fresno County, other than ICE. They're the only ones. We learned a valuable lesson after 9/11, and that's how much we should be speaking and much more we should be speaking to each other between our local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies to keep you safe. So I want to talk a little bit about, and we're going to have lots of questions, I'm sure, because it's complicated. Well, part of the task force that I'm a part of, the Law Enforcement Immigration Reform Task Force. We've got about 5 million people who are legally trying to get into the United States right now waiting in the visa program. And we need to streamline that system. We're in Stanford. I know there's some brilliant Stanford professor or student that could come up with a system that could streamline our immigration system. How do we protect people that have been here and working hard and have been paying their taxes and have been contributing that haven't been committing crimes? How do we support our DACA, which I'm a big supporter of our DACA program? To get into the program, you have to prove you're not a criminal. And that's really what law enforcement is all about. How do we keep you safe? How do we support our immigrant community? How do we ensure that they trust us enough to report when they've been victimized? And it is nuanced, and it is important, and I think it's worth talking about, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As it was mentioned, I'm a DACA recipient, which means that my dreams have an expiration date, and that's when my DACA expires and my work permit expires next year. So our group, San Diego Border Dreamers, was formed as a response of the DACA program being rescinded. And in our activism, we learned that it was very important to advocate not only for a DREAM Act, which would give us a path to citizenship and permanent protection from deportation, but also to understand and advocate for the most vulnerable people in our community, because now we've learned that immigration policy and immigration laws are really about human rights. So I'm undocumented, and we're part of the 11 million people undocumented in this country. And so who are we? Well, we are Rosa Maria Hernandez, who was chased by Border Patrol on her way to the ER for a surgery. And when she woke up to federal agents surrounding her instead of her mother, and then she was placed in a detention center. She has cerebral palsy, 10 years old. We are Gaston, who was deported in San Diego, father of a U.S. citizen autistic child and another U.S. citizen young woman. We are Silvia Campo, a mother, an activist who was checking with ICE prior to this administration in office. Every year she'd go to ICE and check in, and she last reported last year when she was deported. Also mother of a U.S. citizen child with learning disabilities. And we are many other stories. We are an immigrant with 5 U.S. citizen daughters and spouse, unable to adjust status and deported. We are Perla, violently taken away from her daughters in our hometown in San Diego by Border Patrol agents. We are the parents of a 6-month-old who were also surrounded by Border Patrol agents at the hospital, and we are the first dreamer to be deported last year. So our group, we value California Values Act. I think it's very important for our community, given the rhetoric that has been coming out from our president and the administration, creating fear and division in our community, especially in our border towns. In 2007, and the federal government reports this, 32,359 people were placed in detention with no criminal convictions. And that doesn't include people like Gaston, because Gaston has a criminal conviction for illegal entry. In the 90s, 1996, with the passing of IRA, Congress placed bars to adjustment of status for many people, and that created the criminalization of multiple entries into the U.S. without authorization, and that's where Gaston fell into. Those bars from the 90s also created 5 million out of the 11 million people that are undocumented in this country, and that happened in the 90s. And that's a result of our immigration policies and laws. So for us, California values is very important. It states in part, the legislature finds and declares the following: immigrants are valuable and essential members of the California community. Almost 1 in 3 Californians is foreign-born, and 1 in 2 children in California has at least one immigrant parent. So for us, this statement is important. It acknowledges, it recognizes us, it says you are valuable to our community. And especially now with what we're hearing from the federal government, this is symbolically crucial to us. As the sheriff spoke before, a relationship of trust between California's immigrant community and state and local agencies is central to the public safety of the people of California. This trust is threatened when state and local agencies are entangled with federal immigration enforcement, with the result that immigrant community members fear approaching police when they're the victims and witnesses to crimes, seeking basic health services, or attending school, to the detriment of public safety and the well-being of all Californians. Entangling state and local agencies with federal immigration enforcement programs diverts already limited resources and blurs the lines of accountability between local, state, and federal governments. This is the law today. California Values Act, although it is in litigation right now, is the law today. It prohibits state and local police from using resources to investigate, interrogate, detain, detect, or arrest persons for immigration enforcement purposes. It creates safe spaces at school, hospitals, courthouses, by limiting assistance with immigration enforcement to the fullest extent possible, consistent with federal and state law. Again, this is very important to us because it signals, as an undocumented person, we can go to court and pay our traffic ticket. We can take our kids to school. We can go to the hospital and know that the doctor is not going to be calling Border Patrol on us. And so our group, we've taken this as a responsibility to advocate for SB 54, whether it's rallying or lobbying, in particular in San Diego County, because we're a military town, we have ICE, and we have Border Patrol. And Border Patrol has the power to question anyone within 100 miles of the border. So when we talk about border enforcement, Border Patrol is not limited to the wall. They are in our communities, they're riding our buses and our trolleys, they know where we are, they know where people that speak a different language are, they know where immigrant and undocumented community is. And they have the discretion within 100 miles of the border. We have checkpoints coming in and out of San Diego County. We have sheriffs, we have California Highway Patrol, we have local police, we also have schools, school police, and now the president wants to bring over the National Guard. So for us in particular, for those of us that have DACA, there are 40,000 of us in San Diego County. Now with the rescission of the DACA program, SB 54 is crucial to us.
All right, so let's jump right into some questions. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of sanctuary and what it means. When Donald Trump was a candidate and he started talking about doing something about sanctuary cities, there's no definition of what that is. And all of us in journalism were sort of scrambling to define, well, what is a sanctuary city? What is a sanctuary policy? And SB 54 has come out as sort of one flavor of this, but I was hoping you all could give a little bit of insight as to what it means to be a sanctuary policy or a sanctuary jurisdiction, how those kinds of policies affect you and the communities that you're in particular.
So I'll just jump with a little bit of history. So the sanctuary movement goes well before the Trump presidency or even the Obama presidency, right? So the sanctuary movement started in religious institutions, and it started with the issue of Central Americans who were seeking asylum but were not given refugee status because they didn't come from the right country, as it were. They were experiencing extreme repression, but we were allied with the countries that they were coming from. And so with enforcement against those populations, first churches and then it expanded to cities took it upon themselves to say that we will do whatever we can to resist what we consider to be an unjust enforcement policy. And for a while, the federal government gave considered churches and other religious institutions as special places where they would be very careful in terms of the kind of enforcement they would do. But that's changed over time. That's very different from what is called sanctuary cities or jurisdictions today. It's mostly non-cooperation. It is not about preventing any kind of enforcement from happening.
And the issue for law enforcement is, according to our U.S. Attorney General, it is that non-cooperation with immigration. And one of the issues is the 48-hour holds. Well, you need to comply and hold somebody we may want for 48 hours. And our position in the sheriffs is we can't, because it's unconstitutional. You cannot force me to do something that's unconstitutional. Where is the due process? And that's what we look for. You know, what is our authority to hold someone? And so just by saying a sanctuary is non-cooperation is not good enough.
So there's a misconception that sanctuary state means that all of us that are undocumented get a free pass, and that's just not the reality. It just means that the way, and SB 54, it's really not what we were hoping for from the activist point, right? This was something that was, this was the end result, right? And although it's not perfect, I think it serves the purpose so that people that are not committing violent crimes, right? People that, for example, my brother, who was charged with driving with a suspended license. He was put immediately in a detention center because of this charge and spent 2 months in a detention center, and we had to fight his deportation. And in fighting his deportation, my mom testified, and she was also then put in removal proceedings as well. So from a very personal level, to me, what SB 54 means is that somebody driving without a license or with a suspended license from the prior tickets for not driving with a license, that person is not going to be automatically turned over to ICE. And that's what sanctuary means. It doesn't mean that that the state is housing us and now everybody that's undocumented is free to walk around, especially not so in San Diego County, having such a high presence of police or law enforcement. So that's what it means to us, to just know that so long as we are law-abiding, we will not be in trouble. We can report crimes, not necessarily violent crimes, but we can also be witnesses without the fear that someone's going to be turning us over to immigration officials, or we can go to the hospital and know that the doctor is not going to be calling immigration officials.
So let's dig into a little bit of the nitty-gritty with this. I understand that the thrust behind the idea of SB 54 is sort of this enforcement policy change about what sort of this idea of like what constitutes a criminal that is someone who should have enforcement action taken upon them, and what list of crimes do we want to put in this bucket, and what list of crimes do we want to put in this other bucket. To give you an example, in San Diego, in the first part of fiscal 2018, so before SB 54 went into effect, I heard from a lot of attorneys talking about situations like someone who there was like a domestic situation reported between husband and wife. Maybe the wife slapped the husband. It's my understanding is that law enforcement will generally separate the couple at least overnight in order to keep there from being... In
California, there's mandatory arrest. If there's a domestic violence incident that happens and we determine that there has in fact been violence committed, it's not even optional. It's a mandatory arrest, and the primary aggressor will go to jail.
So at least in some of these instances, there are never charges pressed against the person, but under the new administration priorities, without SB 54, that person could then end up in ICE custody and be facing removal proceedings because they sort of came under the radar through the jails. And so maybe just to suss out a little bit of some of those situations where you think the line should be drawn, what should the policy look like? What should be on that list of crimes that you are talking to?
I don't think there should be any restriction in a jail for one law enforcement agency to communicate with another. And I'll tell you why. And one thing we tried to tell the author, he refused to meet with the State Sheriff's Association, by the way, is if you don't allow ICE to do their job in a safe, controlled environment, they're going to go out to our communities, they're going to go out to our businesses, they're going to go out into the communities to do their jobs, and that's exactly what's happened. And unfortunately, what happens is not only the person they're looking for do they contact, but anyone else in that household or in the vicinity, or anyone else that might be there illegally, and they get swept up in this. And that creates a fear in our community that is avoidable if they could do the job in our jails, dealing with that one person. And to me, I see that as a problem.
I think while that is true, I think it's really, if you look at the way this administration is doing its enforcement, including people that are doing their annual registration and putting them into detention for violations that minor violations that might have happened a decade or two prior. I think it's hard to say that ICE is doing this, going into communities only because of SB 54, because it's doing it in other parts of the country and in California before SB 54 passed and even after SB 54 passed. And I think that is something that I think we need to think about is when we look at what California is doing, not just with SB 54, but a whole bunch of other policies. I mean, to some extent, I appreciate that this is the latest thing and it's the big controversial thing right now, but there's a robust set of policies regarding healthcare, regarding access to education, so many other things that we shouldn't see SB 54 just in isolation or as a reaction to the Trump administration. It is part of something that advocates in California have been pushing for well over a decade. And it's kind of, I don't want to say crowning achievement because there's probably additional policies that people want to get passed. But we also need to compare California to other states. So if you look especially in the South, the Southeast, right, in Georgia, where because of that interface between jail cells and ICE, you actually incentivize, or at least you allow for the possibility of local law enforcement that might be racially profiling or doing other things that is not good policing work or good sheriff's work, getting people into the ICE dragnet.
And I think that's a separate issue than what we're talking about. I truly think that's separate. And I want to address what you brought up in one of your slides I totally agree with. The immigrant community, and I can speak for my county, I will speak for Fresno County. I do not believe, nor statistics have not shown that our immigrant community has committed crimes at a higher rate than our non-immigrant communities. In fact, in that 3,000 population that I talked about in our jail, we took a snapshot one day, and there were 90 people in our custody that had immigration holds. It's like, what's that, 3% of our total jail population? So if there's a belief out there that our jails are full of people that are here illegally committing crimes, that is not accurate. That's absolutely not accurate. I believe that the majority of our immigrant population that are here are working hard, trying to support their families and trying to do the right thing. And I want to dispel any kind of myth out there that somebody thinks our jails are just full of immigrants who commit crimes. It's not accurate.
Dulce, did you want to?
Yes, so I fully agree that there has to be some sort of communication. No one wants violent felons in their backyard. No one wants terrorism, right? And if we have one in our jails, then that should be looked into. However, if had we a system in place with more humane immigration laws, with more humane immigration policies, I would fully support having full communication with ICE. If we were to ensure somehow that the 11 million people are undocumented here that are hard workers, that are people like my family, like myself, that perhaps we drive without a driver's license and then we get arrested for driving on a suspended license. The idea that the punishment would be separation of our families for something so small, I don't think that we have a system in place where we can have full cooperation with ICE at this point. Not with this administration and not with all the hateful and divisive rhetoric that's coming from our own president. I don't think that that it's ideal to have that in place right now at this moment. But I do agree that no one wants violent felons in our communities. Right? We live there. My mom and I live there too, so I wouldn't want that either. And as far as the argument that, well, if we get them in the jails and we keep ICE occupied in the jails so that they're not in our communities. The reality is, in areas like San Diego, ICE is everywhere, not just in the jails. And if they're going to be doing their work, from my point of view, why make it easier for them to deport people like the people that I was speaking about earlier? 32,500 and something people without any criminal history were apprehended last year. And ICE is very much in our communities anyways. And in San Diego, we also have Border Patrol. So I don't agree with the argument that it's a favor to our community to have ICE in our jails just because then they're going to be occupied in our jails instead of in our communities. They're already in our communities.
So I want to acknowledge that this is an economic institute, an institute on economic policy, and I want to dive into a little bit about how all of this relates to economics. How does providing sanctuary or not providing sanctuary, who we choose to take enforcement against, what kind of effects does that have on economies in the local area?
So I'll say a couple of things. I mean, there's so many economic angles one can look into this, but there's been research by Tom Wong and others which show that sanctuary cities, after they implement their policies, tend to do better economically. Another thing I want to say just about, the fact that we're even having this conversation now when we have a booming economy and a very tight labor market is just kind of crazy, right? So if you think about immigration restriction, the traditional view of immigration restriction was that it would be very responsive to the economic cycle. So when you have a big recession, like in California in 1990, 1991, the big impetus for Prop 187, a whole bunch of these restriction policies, was that you had massive economic pain in California. But let's look at the 2 times since then when you've had a massive increase in restrictionist sentiment and policies. 2006, 2007, and then now. Booming economic times, very tight labor market. This is primarily a politically and partisan-driven dynamic to make this a top of the agenda issue. And I'm not saying that it's entirely one-sided, but what we show in our book, The New Immigration Federalism, is that over time, especially within the Republican Party, immigration has now occupied a place that abortion used to occupy, and it's the result of these issue entrepreneurs working within the party to push out any moderate voice through the primary process to make sure that that party's gotten more and more extreme. So Tom Tancredo was a Tea Partier before the Tea Party existed, and he kept making the Republican caucus in the House more and more conservative on immigration. Sensenbrenner used to be a moderate on immigration in 2001. And he authors the bill in 2005 that raised a lot of hackles in terms of immigration enforcement. So we cannot ignore, even though economics matters, it is primarily one that is driven by symbolism, but importantly, party dynamics and partisan politics.
I agree. And really, and when you talk about the economics, a part of California, I come from the Central Valley, is an ag central. That is our economy. It's billions of dollars just in Fresno County every year. And what has happened as a result of the immigration issue is our farmers not being able to find labor. My first job, I will tell you, I picked grapes in the field in Fresno County. And tomatoes. Those were my first jobs. And it's hard work. And it's not unskilled labor. You better know where you're prune that vine to make sure you've got a crop the next year. So it's not all unskilled labor, and we need the people to do that. The overarching issue is reform. We need immigration reform so badly so that we can protect those who have been here for years, who have worked hard, who have not committed crimes, to give them that pathway that they need to be here legally. That's very important to our economy. It's very important to our workforce. It's very important to a lot of things that we need. I heard Feifei's story about her coming here, and they did that all legally. I think that's wonderful. And what we need is to have a way to have people here that are legally, because it's true, we are all immigrants, every single one of us. We just are. So how do we solve that overarching problem? Because it would solve so many issues. Immigration is a federal responsibility. I don't want any part of immigration enforcement with my deputy sheriffs. out in the street. I don't want any part of that because it is counterproductive to a population that I believe is victimized much more than we ever know. I know every summer we've got people out in our fields that get raped, robbed, their vehicles stolen because they're afraid to report it. And I work very hard to try to get the message out there. If you report, I can help you be here legally. And what we find out from people that get booked into our jail, guess who they prey on? Guess who their victims are? Our immigrant population. Because they threaten. If you report, you know you're going to be deported. And we've got to stop that rhetoric, and we've got to start working seriously on immigration reform.
Dulce, did you want to?
Yeah. So there's a research that came out that undocumented people, contrary to the popular belief, that we contribute every year by way of taxes about $13 billion a year. And so we do pay taxes. My parents have been paying taxes for close to 30 years now as undocumented people. So we contribute to the economy by way of labor, as Margaret is mentioning, and also by way of taxes. And so there needs to be a program, hopefully a reform, a comprehensive immigration reform, but at the minimum an opportunity to work lawfully, because we can only imagine what those numbers would look like if people like my parents would have a work permit, right? With the rescission of the DACA program, it's estimated that we would be losing about $430-something billion in the course of 10 years now with the program rescinded. So yeah, economically, it makes no sense to deny us a work permit or even to suppress us more than what we already experience.
So I feel like we've barely scratched the surface on an incredibly complex topic, but I know there's not a whole lot of time left, and I do want to make sure if there's a burning question in the audience that it gets asked. I have a ton more, but I'm sure you do too. So in the back, I think was the first hand, and then there you go. Maybe we can be quick.
Hello. Okay, great. Thank you all for being here. My question is for Sheriff Mims. We talked a lot about SB 54, and I'm curious to know now, given the limitations placed on responding to notification requests under the Values Act, what is the procedure you now use to receive an ICE notification request? And what's your policy for determining which requests to comply with?
We don't hold anybody on that 48-hour hold. We have to have an actual warrant that a judge or a federal magistrate has signed. So we don't pick and choose. Nobody gets held for that 48-hour hold. Unless they can show some kind of due process, we don't hold them.
Second question here.
I think your data showed for breakdown of the 11 million illegal immigrants by origin was what, 40% Asian, 45% Mexican, South American, and 10% other, or something, what the numbers were.
Well, that wasn't that. That was a different data point. That was looking at the growth over time.
That was the growth.
But go ahead and ask.
I'm wondering if those who are actually subject to deportation these days are the same proportional representation as those who are illegal, because the images are certainly mostly Central American, Mexican.
So this is something that Duncan Lawrence, who's at the Immigration Policy Lab here, and we're talking about this morning. It's something that I think the movement needs to have a real conversation about, is the differential in enforcement on undocumented populations. So if you're a brown immigrant, you get, or even a brown person, you get stopped on suspicion of immigration violations a lot more than if you're not brown, right? And so that's something that we need to some extent. The reason why I think about this is that I have a hunch, it needs to be tested, that might in part account for lower uptake of Asian Americans in DACA and the AB60 driver license program, because there's less risk of being caught in that law enforcement dragnet to then be put into detention and deportation. So yeah, it does, I mean, if you look at the statistics on enforcement, there does seem to be a pretty strong bias towards Mexican immigrants and Latin American immigrants as opposed to Asian immigrants.
I'd like to maybe just jump in super quick in terms of the faces that you see in the media in terms of the stories. I think that historically the Latino community has organized a lot and activism has given some level of support to people who come out and speak up and share their story. And in some of the other communities, at least in San Diego, there's a little bit more of a sense of shame of admitting your status or admitting that this happened to you or happened to someone in your family. And it's a lot harder to get them to talk on the record and share their story. You know, we have people who are DACA recipients from all over the world in San Diego. Most of the people who are willing to do interviews with me are Mexican. And that's something that I worked to try and do as much as I can as a journalist, but there's different cultural feelings in that as well.
So this is really a question for Professor Ramakrishnan. So if I understand your argument correctly, it's that the political elite, especially in the Republican Party, is mobilized against the immigrant population. But it's also the case that, as you pointed out, when the immigrant population in the U.S., so the foreign-born population, has approached 15%, at the beginning of the 20th century or now, that you've had a reaction against it. So the alternative interpretation would be you're getting a kind of nativist reaction. It's not really the political elite that's creating this nativist reaction. How do you distinguish between these two interpretations?
So I don't think there's anything magical about the number 15, right? In fact, you had a lot of people. So when we came out, when I came out with the kind of prior argument before the book to say that this is a largely politically driven process and not a demographically driven process, people in political science, people in legal studies just said it cannot be true. Because you look, you're seeing this big influx of immigrants, undocumented immigrants going to the Midwest, going to the South. These new immigrant destinations also happen to be the place where people are just not used to change and they're freaking out, essentially, right? But there's change happening throughout the country without incident. But many of these places are places where Republicans are strong, and it has taken on significant symbolic value. So in some of these places, people pointed to Alabama and said, well, Alabama had a 100% increase in its undocumented population over a decade, and that explains what happened. Well, it went from like 1.5% to 3% of the population. Is that something that's perceptible? It's a big percentage change. I'm not sure that it actually means much in terms of actual policy problems. And especially if you're thinking about crime and other kind of bad things happening in communities because of immigrants coming in, it's not at all clear that that's happening. If you look at the prior historical period, we went through this period of nativism. I mean, it was a prior version of making America great again, right? They said, look at all these Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans. Now, they were causing trouble because there was a lot of labor radicalism in cities. They said, can't we have the immigrants that were the good immigrants, which were the Germans and the Northern Europeans? So they tried to turn the clock back to the 1860s and 1870s. If you think about actual problems that exist from immigrants here today, it pales in comparison to what people perceived the problem to be in the 1920s. And yet, perception is in many ways more important than reality, and we see that playing out today.
So I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you to the panel, and thank you all.